But also, just a little historical footnote, not insignificant. It was Cheney and the neocons that were driving this. Bush was, the kind of front. He was the figurehead, the front man for this. But it was, Cheney and his neocon troop, who are still essentially, the neocon project is still ongoing, and back in the 2000s under Bush, they actually wanted to start not only a war with Iran, because they believed that only little boys go to Iraq, real men go to Iran, but they also wanted to start a war with China. So it goes back as far as then. And now here we are again, and we're looking at imminent war with China, or Pete Hegseth calls it, China is an imminent threat, and we are preparing for war.
He said, if the president tells me we will fight and win a war against China over Taiwan, that's astonishing. And I give me about two or three more minutes, because I do want to show the speech for Hegseth. This is a lunatic, deranged, out of his mind, alcoholic, giving a speech to the Asian nations. And by the way, when he was there, notice he didn't say anything about South Korea. Like, he named all of these other nations that he expected to help him out, contain, and apparently fight China. South Korea was not part of that list. South Korea was not part of that list. At least I don't think it was.
But do you know when he did mention South Korea? 4 months ago, at his confirmation hearing, Tammy Duckworth asked him to name an ASEAN nation. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. He asked him, name an ASEAN nation. And he named South Korea and Japan. And she had to flat him down and tell him, those are not ASEAN nations. They are not in Southeast Asia. So we're doing, on-the-job education for, the Secretary of Defense. And he's going to learn by going to war or waging war. So, I mean, this is the terrible, scary thing, is that we get people who, just don't even have basic knowledge, just, kindergarten level of geography. And then they are going to make decisions that affect the entire planet, including Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia.
Yes, amazing. This is Hegseth given one of the most deranged, out of their mind speeches. And keep in mind, every accusation is a confession in this. We're not trying to surround China. Okay, that's a bit weird, considering you have Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, all of these countries that seem to be surrounding China. Oh, we're not trying to look for aggression. That's kind of weird, since you have U.S. military personnel that are on the island of Taiwan and you're giving them weapons left and right. Like, meaning all of the stuff that he's saying is utterly nonsense. I'm only going to play a small bit of this, but I want to get your take on this before we close. Okay, why can't I hear you, Hegseth?
We share your vision of peace and stability of prosperity. The United States stands ready to work with any country that is willing to step up and preserve the global and regional peace that we all hold dear. Your presence here today sends a strong message about our shared purpose, our shared commitment to peace, our shared dedication to a free and open Indo-Pacific. And as our allies share the burden, we can increase our focus on the Indo-Pacific, our priority theater. You see, here in the Indo-Pacific, our futures are bound together. The prosperity and security of the American people are linked to those of your people. We share your vision of peace and stability, of prosperity and security. And we are here to stay. Any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be.
Talk about a person ahead of their skis. This goofball is Department of Defense, a television personality. We think the threat that China poses is imminent. Correct me if I'm wrong. China would never have even countenance going after Taiwan if it wasn't for the U.S. putting troops, salami slicing the communiques, basically pushing and agitating for this notion of Taiwanese independence. Like, it's just, like, that speech is astonishing. Give me a take on that.
Yes. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. China wants peaceful reunification with Taiwan, who they call their compatriots, their
Mhm.
family, essentially. And so anytime, people from Taiwan region, if they get into trouble around the world, who bails them out? It's the Chinese government. If they get caught up in Myanmar, they get caught up in Ukraine, it's the Chinese government that rescues them and flies them home. So, I mean, the Chinese see the people of Taiwan province as their compatriots because they are literally family. And what the US is doing here is it's getting involved in a family quarrel. What is that family quarrel? Well, they had a civil war. After the civil war, a group of them, essentially the fascist group, decamped to an island and then declared that they were all of China and that the Communist Party was illegitimate. It's a little bit like the US Civil War. During the Civil War itself, after the Confederacy lost the war, they camped off to Galveston Island, just off of Texas. And then they were regrouping and they claimed that they were, the entirety of the United States. Now, can you imagine? I mean, it's a little bit of a stretch, but can you imagine if China had said to the Union Army and the United States, if you go in to Galveston Island and you try to, reunify your country, we will wage war against you. That would be outrageous. That would be off the charts, insane. But that's essentially what Pete Hegseth has done. Essentially, what he said is that let's remember Taiwan is Chinese territory, it's part of China. The US recognizes this. The UN recognizes this. The Taiwan Constitution recognizes this. Entire world recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. And Pete Hegseth has said that we will tell you what to do about your own sovereign territory that we recognize as your sovereign territory. It's such an extraordinary violation of international law. So essentially, it is a provocation to war. If you exercise your sovereign rights regarding Taiwan, we will destroy you. And we are preparing for that. That's the message that he has sent right now. And it's such a, extraordinary, belligerent, bellicose, threatening, you know, violation of international law. I don't understand why it isn't all over the media. Hegseth says something wrong. He leaks something on an app. It's all over the press, and he's being called out in Congress around this, and he declares war. This is an open declaration of war against China. It's essentially, it's like the concluding argument of a prosecutor, of a prosecutor who's prosecuting for war. And there is no critique of that. Rather, they're saying, oh, he sucked it, he socked it to the Chinese. Good job, Pete, our man, The only problem is, Trump is unreliable. He might not follow through. This is, Time magazine. So it's just kind of extraordinary. Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's effectively declaring Taiwanese sovereign independence. The
Yes.
speech, for all intents and purposes, declares Taiwanese independence. We're willing to fight a war over Taiwanese independence.
Yes.
That is pretty astonishing.
Yes.
That's never been done before. Like, meaning the U.S. has never. When Joe Biden said something like that, it was out there. People were like, "Oh my God, Joe Biden is really saying that he's going to fight a war for Taiwan."
Mm-hmm.
Hegseth is effectively saying not effectively, he is saying the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're willing to do that, where you're willing to say, this place is independent, and we will fight for its independence, then by definition, you're declaring it independent. Like that speech is so problematic.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
so-
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
the extraordinary threat inflation, right? This is why I say it's like the concluding argument of a prosecutor in a courtroom. Like he's saying this, and you can tell it was written by a lawyer. It's probably written by Elbridge Colby, because this is Colby's plan: provoke war against China over Taiwan, gather all U.S. quote unquote allies, really vassals, get them involved in the fight, and then use it to bring down China. This is Elbridge Colby's strategy of denial. But the amount of mendacity and threat inflation that is thrown in there, as you point out, it's all projection. The US is provoking China. It is encircling China. All things that he said are not happening. It is literally encircling China. All you have to do is look at a map, look at the bases, look at the exercises. They're staging the war, the theater of war for imminent combat. This is what they're preparing for. They say China is going to take Taiwan by 2027. If you ask them to come up with where they got that figure from, they cannot show any proof. It's all of them self-referring to each other. They invented it, and then they're just kind of self-referring to each other and saying, this proves that China has designs. No, China doesn't have a design to take Taiwan by 2027. And then, China has the, greatest, military buildup. No, it has reduced its military by 2 million people since 1985. And, within the last decade, by 300,000. They're not a belligerent state. Or China, has the world's greatest navy or naval buildup. No, China's naval buildup is about half of that of the United States in terms of tonnage. They have lots of small littoral ships. These are primarily for self-defense. They don't have blue water capacity. So all of these things are wrong. The only thing which is real, again, the tiny grain of truth, is that China is capable of defending itself, and it will defend itself. And it is not going to let itself be choked out and humiliated and raped like it was for 150 years by the Western powers, which is what happened prior to that. That's when 1949 China stood up, and it's made the decision that it's never going to allow that to happen again. And that's why it has a powerful defensive capacity in its own littoral waters and on its own territory. But Hegseth has characterized this as, China is belligerent and doing terrible things. I mean, let's look at just one more example, the South China Sea. They say, China has built islands on the South China Sea. Well, first, China claims those islands as its own territory. It has historical records that go back at least 1,000 years showing that it was using those islands. And it has built military facilities and airstrips. But guess what? There are 6 claimants to the South China Sea whose claims all intersect and overlap. And 5 of them have built airstrips. And 6 of them, all 6 of them, have built military facilities on certain islands of the South China Sea. So China is not an outlier there. It's the same as everybody else. And China built its military facilities in response to the US plan of war against China called Air-Sea Battle, which involves choking it off at the South China Sea in order to strangle it, because that's where $5 trillion worth of Chinese trade goes through, and 70% of China's oil. This is part of the plan of war, is to choke China out. They started planning this in 2009. 4 or 5 years later, China started to build some defensive outposts because they knew that that's what the US was planning. And they're pretending that their provocation never happened, and it's China that is belligerently militarizing the South China Sea when all of them are. And then they also talk about, the Chinese are, attacking ships and threatening other ships. Let's look at this. When you have naval contestations over territory, these get pretty rough. And China is really a Boy Scout in all of this. The NATO nations have gone to war over contested sea territory. We have the Turbo Wars, the Cod Wars. These are like ships ramming each other, weapons being used. These are incredible wars between NATO allies amongst themselves. And if you look at, for example, another claimant in the South China Sea, Indonesia. Indonesia has taken every ship that it has considered to be intruding into its EEZ, and
Wow.
it has shot and sunk at least 370 of them. 370 ships have been shot down and sunk and set on fire by Indonesia alone. China has never done anything like that. The only thing they've done is sprayed water. But this is the thing that they want to make the federal case about and say, China is the big belligerent without putting it into context.
U.S. has, what, 800 and something military bases around the world? They are not the ones to talk. It's just like, yeah, they're not the ones to talk. I've gotten to the point where when they say this stuff, it's just language. It doesn't mean anything. Like the meaning is we're a superpower and we don't like the fact that you're contesting us. But the truth of the matter is, if China couldn't defend itself, if Iran couldn't defend itself, if Russia couldn't defend itself, all of those would be toppled governments by now. So, like I said, people take their respect at the barrel of a gun. And China, at some point, and this could be the last comment that I get from you, there will come a day or a moment where the U.S. is doing the same thing to China that it did to Russia over Ukraine. And I know it's different because Taiwan is part of China, so it's just that even more outrageous. But that speech by Hegseth is effectively, Taiwan is independent. And China, at some point, is either going to have to let Taiwan go or fight for Taiwan. There's not going to be a middle ground on it. They're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And then they're going to go to Europe and say, oh my God, look at what China did. But there's not going to be a way out that box that I'm aware of. Europe can commit suicide by all of a sudden not wanting to use Russian energy and not wanting to use products from China. Good luck with that. They can do that. I get the sense that the rest of the world, however, is going to see it for what it is. But maybe there's a way out. Maybe China is better and can find a way out of that box.
Well, I think
last thought, KJ.
ASEAN has already spoken out on this. Malaysia and the Southeast Asian countries, except for the Philippines, which is the other stooge. It's going to be used like Ukraine, like Taiwan. ASEAN has spoken out and said, we are not going to choose sides. China is a good partner with us. If you look at all the economic developments that's happening across Southeast Asia, all of that is happening because of China, because of trade with China, because China's helping build infrastructure, and because China is showing the way and the model of development. All of the Southeast Asian countries are benefiting from that. They do not want to go to war with the United States, although the US wants to use them all as proxies and vassals. So ASEAN has spoken out, and also the Gulf Cooperation Council has also spoken out because they have joined ASEAN, and they're in the process of signing more agreements and creating more connection and interchange. All of this is a direct refutation of the US approach, which is bloc forming in order to escalate for war. They're saying no. They're speaking with their feet and with their wallets. But you are absolutely right. What the US is trying to do is trying to replicate what it did in Ukraine against China. And essentially, the original plan was to pull a USSR on China. China was going to be dismembered, opened up and dismembered, privatized and sold to Western corporations. And they, wanted, a Gorbachev, Yeltsin type character. That never happened. They tried really hard. It never happened. But they were thinking, oh, it will happen. China will fall apart. It's going to, dissolve of its own contradictions because, socialism doesn't work. And then it turned out that, in 2008, the capitalist system collapsed around its own ears. And the only thing standing really was China. They had to go to China and with hat in hand and beg for money. Hank Paulson wanted the Chinese to buy US treasuries, and China, foolishly bailed them out. And of course, no good deed goes unpunished. Yep. That's when the daggers came out. That's when they directly started to plan for war against China, because they understood China is not going to collapse of its own accord. not going to collapse from its internal contradictions. It needs a good push down the stairs. And so that's when air-sea battle was launched. And then 2012, the pivot to Asia. And then we saw the TPP, which was the economic encirclement. And then continuing up through the Trump doctrine and the Biden doctrine, the Indo-Pacific strategy. All of this is a continuous, unending, momentum and movement towards war. And Pete Hegseth has essentially, made the final case. This is the prosecuting attorney's, final argument in the courtroom. He's saying, we are going to go to war. And he's made that declaration. And it's frightening and insane.
The U.S. empire is going to collapse. I don't know how it manages its contradictions. And the hope is that it does so before it provokes some kind of larger war in this way. And look, I'm not saying that out of malice. I'm saying it just out of, how are you $36 trillion in debt and continuously escalating that to $20 trillion? And you're destroying social services. You're destroying, meaning things that are required for a society to function, they don't seem to care about. They seem to care about it when they were in competition with the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet Union fell apart, that need to compete, that need to provide these a contrast seemed to have just vanished. And when they realized they were in competition with China, it never kicked back on. Like, it never seemed to click that, hey, they're providing a living. They pulled 800 million people, billion people out of poverty, million people out of poverty. They did. It never clicked. There's something fundamentally wrong with this country. It is incompetent. The leaders that it's making are incompetent. The decisions that they make no sense in the context of what is in the best interest of the country. It's just bizarre. So hopefully we get out of this without us ending the world on our way down. KJ, thank you for this, man. I always appreciate these conversations. The audience loves you to death. We had nearly 900 people here today. So definitely had a really good audience. Thank you for this. You be safe. And just for the audience to know, KJ No, he's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher, specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region, contributor to the book, Capitalism on a Ventilator. You can get it on iacenter.org. You can also find KJ on the China Report on the Breakthrough News Network. And one last thing before I let KJ go. I would like to congratulate KJ. KJ has been awarded the Serena Shim Award. Welcome to the team. Congratulations, man.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very honored. And I want to point out that you too are an awardee of the prize.
I am.
As well as
just a week before you. That's all. It's like when both of us are born in together.
As well as John Pilger and
yes.
Julian Assange and many, many other great journalists. I'm deeply honored to be in that pantheon of extraordinary people.
Yeah, I felt the same way.
Journalists.
Yeah, I felt the same way. I had this feeling of when you are right now I'm in Malaysia. And before Malaysia, I was in Albania. And, for the most part, I just work all day. Like, you're just in a room, in a box. You spend 8, 10 hours either doing videos, cutting videos, doing news, etc. That's just your life. And you don't really know anybody's paying attention to that. You just kind of do it every day like a hamster on a wheel. And it feels good for an award, especially with the pedigree of people who are on it, to acknowledge, hey, we see what you're doing. Good job. It just feels good. So, no, congratulations, man. You kick ass. My audience loves you to bits. And yeah, you kick ass. So good job, man. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Jamal.
Alrighty. All right, guys, we have come to the end.